The crimson lights of Troxus II's research facility cast long shadows across the sterile corridors as Dr. Aaron Veck made his way to Laboratory Complex 7. Outside the reinforced viewing ports, the moon's harsh surface stretched endlessly, its crystalline formations catching the distant glow of the gas giant it orbited. This was home to the Deathworld Council, an alliance of planets whose environments had forged the most resilient species in the known galaxy. Aaron paused at the laboratory entrance, his four-fingered hand hovering over the biometric scanner. Behind those sealed doors lay the most ambitious project of his career, perhaps of the entire Council's scientific history. Standard Cycle 325 had begun with routine xenobiology surveys. But everything changed when the deep space monitoring stations detected something extraordinary from the Sol system. The scanner hummed, recognizing his genetic signature, and the massive doors slid apart with a pneumatic hiss. Inside, the laboratory buzzed with activity. Holographic displays flickered with data streams. Nanoscale imaging systems hummed softly. And in the center of it all sat the prize that had brought them here. A single strand of deoxyribonucleic acid from a species calling themselves humans. "Dr. Veck," called out Engineer Tal Richter from across the lab. His enthusiasm barely contained despite the early hour. "The overnight analysis is complete. You're going to want to see this." Aaron approached the primary console, where Tal stood beside a three-dimensional molecular model, rotating slowly in the holographic field. The DNA structure looked deceptively simple compared to the complex genetic matrices of most Deathworld species. Yet the preliminary scans had revealed something that defied everything they thought they knew about biological resilience. "Run me through it again," Aaron said, though he had memorized every detail of their initial findings. The implications were simply too staggering to accept without repeated verification. Tal gestured to the display, his excitement making his voice rise in pitch. "The base organism originates from what they call Earth, a planet that should be classified as a mild garden world by our standards. Oxygen-nitrogen atmosphere, liquid water, moderate gravity, stable climate. By all accounts, it should produce soft, fragile life forms." "And yet," Aaron prompted, though he already knew the answer, "and yet the genetic structure suggests adaptive capabilities that exceed even our most hardy Deathworld specimens. Look at this." Tal manipulated the display, zooming in on specific genetic sequences. "These markers here indicate cellular regeneration rates that rival the crystal worms of Hades Prime. These sequences suggest oxygen deprivation tolerance, comparable to the deep void dwellers of Vacuum Station. And this entire section appears to govern rapid hematopoietic restructuring under extreme stress." Dr. Sarah Mox chose that moment to enter the laboratory, her expression characteristically grave. As the Council's leading expert in consciousness simulation and artificial psychology, she had been assigned to the project specifically to monitor the ethical implications of their research. Her species, native to the perpetually storm-racked world of Tempest, had evolved an almost supernatural ability to read emotional states and predict psychological outcomes. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying the weight of unspoken concerns, "I've reviewed the project parameters for today's experiment. I must reiterate my reservations about activating the consciousness simulation protocol." Aaron turned to face her, noting the way her bioluminescent patches flickered with agitation. "Dr. Mox, we've been over this. The simulation is completely contained within our nanoscale environment. There's no risk to actual human life, as we're working purely with reconstructed cellular matrices and synthesized neural patterns." "That's precisely my concern," Sarah replied, moving to her own workstation. "We're creating what amounts to a living, thinking, being purely for the purpose of subjecting it to stress testing. The ethical implications are staggering." "The Council has approved the parameters," Tal interjected, perhaps more sharply than he intended. We need to understand how these organisms respond to extreme stimuli. That's the entire point of the project. Sarah's patches flashed brighter, a clear sign of her mounting frustration. And what happens when our simulation develops beyond our control? What happens when it experiences genuine suffering? Then we'll have learned something invaluable about the nature of consciousness itself, Aaron said quietly. Besides, it's only a simulation. We can terminate it at any time. The words felt hollow, even as he spoke them. Throughout his career, Aaron had prided himself on maintaining scientific objectivity. But something about this project gnawed at him. Perhaps it was the uncanny human-like appearance of their reconstructed specimens. Or perhaps it was the growing complexity of the neural patterns they had observed. Either way, he pushed his doubts aside. The Deathworld Council needed to understand these beings, especially if the intelligence reports about human expansion into space proved accurate. "Shall we begin?" he asked, moving to the primary control console. The next several hours passed in a blur of preparation and calibration. The consciousness simulation required perfect synchronization between the genetic reconstruction matrix, the neural pattern synthesizer, and the environmental stress chambers. They would be creating, in essence, a fully functional human consciousness housed within a cellular structure that could experience all the sensations and responses of living tissue. Their subject would be designated Specimen Homo sapiens alpha, though in the privacy of his own thoughts. Aaron had begun thinking of it simply as the human. The reconstruction process had been based on multiple genetic samples recovered from the Sol system, carefully analyzed and combined to create what their computers determined would be a representative example of the species. Genetic matrix stable, Tal reported from his station. Neural patterns are within normal parameters for the base template. Consciousness simulation is ready for activation. Environmental controls? Aaron asked. All systems green. We can simulate anything from their homeworld standard conditions to Category 5 environmental extremes. Dr. Mock's monitoring systems? Psychological and emotional response tracking is online, she replied, though her tone remained troubled. I am detecting preliminary neural activity consistent with early consciousness formation. Aaron took a deep breath. In all his years of xenobiology research, he had never attempted to create an artificial consciousness, let alone one based on an entirely unknown species. The scientific potential was unprecedented, but so was the weight of responsibility. Initialize consciousness simulation, he commanded. The laboratory filled with a low humming as the quantum processors engaged, their calculations creating patterns of thought and awareness within the reconstructed neural matrix. On the holographic displays, synaptic pathways began firing in complex cascades, creating the unmistakable signature of conscious thought. Consciousness is stabilizing, Sarah reported, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm reading emotional baselines consistent with curiosity and mild anxiety. It's trying to understand where it is. The reality of what they had just accomplished struck Aaron like a physical blow. They had created life, not just biological function, but actual, thinking, feeling life. The ethical implications that Sarah had warned about suddenly seemed far more pressing. What are its perceptions? He asked. Sensory input is minimal right now, Tal explained. We're keeping it in a neutral environment while it acclimates. Standard atmospheric conditions, comfortable temperature, minimal stimuli. It's afraid, Sarah said suddenly, her bioluminescent patches pulsing rapidly. There's definitely fear present, but also a strong drive toward understanding and adaptation. The emotional complexity is far greater than our models predicted. Aaron studied the neural activity patterns on his display. The consciousness they had created was displaying remarkable sophistication, processing information and forming responses with a speed and complexity that rivaled many of the Deathworld Council's member species. Begin Phase 1, environmental testing, he decided. Gradual introduction of mild stressors. What kind of stressors? Tal asked. Start with atmospheric variations. Reduce oxygen content by 10% and monitor the response. The changes were implemented gradually, and the results were immediate. The simulated human cellular structure began adapting almost instantly, optimizing oxygen usage and increasing respiratory efficiency. More remarkably, the consciousness appeared to recognize what was happening and actively participate in the adaptation process. Fascinating, Aaron murmured. It's not just passively adapting, it's consciously directing its own biological responses. The fear levels are decreasing, Sarah observed. As it successfully adapts to each challenge, its confidence grows. There's almost a sense of pride in its capabilities. They continued with increasingly challenging environmental conditions throughout the day. Temperature variations, pressure changes, atmospheric composition shifts, even mild toxin exposure. Each time, the human consciousness not only adapted, but seemed to thrive on the challenge. Its neural patterns showed increased activity and complexity with each successful adaptation. This is unprecedented, Tal breathed, staring at the data streams flowing across his displays. Its cellular regeneration rates are increasing with each stress test. It's not just surviving these conditions, it's actually becoming stronger. The psychological profile is equally remarkable, Sarah added. Instead of trauma or degradation, I'm seeing enhanced problem-solving capabilities and increased emotional resilience. This consciousness is treating extreme adversity as a learning opportunity. As the hours passed, Aaron found himself increasingly amazed by their creation. The human consciousness was displaying levels of adaptability that surpassed even the most extreme Deathworld species. More troubling, though, was his growing sense of connection to the being they had created. It wasn't just a specimen anymore. It was becoming a person. Dr. Vec, came a voice from the laboratory entrance. Aaron turned to see Elder Director Joran approaching, flanked by several other council members. The director's massive, armored form commanded immediate attention, his species having evolved on a world where predators the size of mountains roamed freely. Elder Director, Aaron replied, offering the traditional gesture of respect. To what do we owe the honor of your visit? The preliminary reports have been most intriguing, Joran rumbled, his voice carrying harmonics that lesser species found unsettling. The Council is eager to see the full capabilities of this human specimen. We've been conducting systematic stress testing, Aaron explained. The results exceed all projections. So I've heard. I understand you plan to test its pain tolerance and trauma response. Aaron felt a chill run through him. That's correct. Though we were planning to approach that phase gradually, with appropriate safeguards. Time is a luxury we may not have, Joran replied. Intelligence reports suggest these humans are expanding aggressively through their local stellar region. We need to understand their full capabilities, including their responses to extreme trauma. Dr. Mox stepped forward, her bioluminescent patches flashing in alarm. Elder Director, I must protest. The consciousness we've created is displaying remarkable sophistication. Subjecting it to extreme trauma could constitute torture of a sentient being. It is a simulation, Joran stated flatly. A tool for understanding a potential threat. Proceed with the trauma testing immediately. The weight of authority was absolute. In Deathworld culture, survival of the group superseded individual concerns, even for artificially created individuals. Aaron found himself caught between his scientific curiosity, his growing ethical concerns, and his duty to the Council. Very well, he said quietly. Tal, prepare for Phase 3 testing. What parameters? Tal asked, his earlier enthusiasm noticeably diminished. Extreme physical trauma simulation, Aaron replied, the words feeling like ash in his mouth. We need to understand the species' pain tolerance and psychological breaking points. The next hour was spent in preparation for what would prove to be the most disturbing experiment of Aaron's career. They would subject their created consciousness to simulated physical trauma while monitoring both its biological responses and psychological state. The goal was to determine whether humans could be broken through torture or if their remarkable adaptability extended to extreme suffering. All systems prepared, Tal reported, though he seemed to be avoiding eye contact with anyone in the room. Psychological monitoring at maximum sensitivity, Sarah added, though I wanted on record that I consider this approach both scientifically questionable and ethically reprehensible. Your objection is noted, Elder Director Joran replied curtly. Proceed. Aaron's finger hovered over the activation control. In that moment, he could feel the weight of every choice that had brought them to this point. The excitement of discovery, the pressure of duty, the terrible responsibility of creating life only to subject it to suffering. Execute, he whispered. The trauma simulation began gradually, introducing sensations of physical pain through the neural interface. The human consciousness reacted immediately, its confusion and distress visible in the rapid firing of neural pathways. But rather than breaking down or retreating, something extraordinary happened. The consciousness began to fight back. Not just psychologically, but at a cellular level. The simulated human's biological systems started responding to the trauma with unprecedented intensity. Cellular regeneration accelerated, neural pathway reinforcement increased, and most remarkably, the consciousness began actively modifying its own pain response mechanisms. This isn't possible, Tal gasped, staring at his readings. It's rewriting its own neurological structure in real time. The psychological profile is off all our charts, Sarah reported, her voice tight with amazement and horror. Instead of breaking down, it's becoming more resilient. The trauma is actually strengthening it. But something else was happening, something that none of their models had predicted. As the human consciousness fought against the simulated torture, it began generating electromagnetic signatures that their equipment wasn't designed to handle. Energy levels in the consciousness simulation chamber started fluctuating wildly. Aaron, Sarah called out, her voice now edged with panic. The consciousness is destabilizing the containment matrix. It's fighting so hard against the simulation that it's affecting the physical systems. How is that possible? Elder Director Joran demanded. I don't know, Aaron replied, frantically working at his controls. The energy output is exceeding all theoretical limits. It's as if the consciousness refuses to accept the reality of its situation. The laboratory filled with alarms as the containment systems began overloading. The human consciousness, faced with unbearable trauma, was somehow generating enough psychic energy to affect the quantum processors maintaining its existence. But more than that, it was beginning to emit something else entirely. A sound. At first, it was barely perceptible, a low-frequency vibration that resonated through the laboratory structure. But as the consciousness fought harder against its torment, the sound grew in intensity and complexity. It wasn't random noise or simple electromagnetic interference. It was something far more disturbing. It was a scream. Not just any scream, but a sound that carried within it all the rage, despair, and indomitable will of a species that had evolved to survive anything the universe could throw at them. The sound bypassed their auditory systems and struck directly at some primal fear center, a frequency that every sentient being was programmed to recognize as the cry of something in mortal agony. "Shut it down!" Sarah shouted over the rising wail. "We have to shut it down now!" But the consciousness was beyond their control. The human mind, faced with unbearable torture, was doing something that no Deathworld species had ever done. Instead of adapting or breaking, it was rejecting the very premise of its situation. It was screaming not just in pain, but in defiance of the idea that any being had the right to subject it to such treatment. The scream grew louder, more complex, harmonizing with itself in ways that hurt to hear. Every being in the laboratory felt it in their bones, a sound that spoke of untamed fury and absolute refusal to submit. The quantum processors began overheating as they struggled to contain a consciousness that was actively rebelling against the fundamental nature of its existence. "The containment matrix is failing," Tal screamed over the noise. "The consciousness is overloading every system simultaneously." Sparks flew from control panels as the human scream reached levels that no artificial system had been designed to withstand. The laboratory's lights flickered and dimmed as power was redirected to maintain containment. But even that wasn't enough. The consciousness they had created was expressing its pain and rage with such intensity that it was literally tearing apart the systems that held it. And then, in a cascade of electrical failure and quantum decoherence, everything collapsed. The scream cut off abruptly as the consciousness simulation matrix finally overloaded completely. Emergency lighting cast everything in a hellish red glow as the main power systems went offline. The silence that followed was more disturbing than the screaming had been, a pregnant quiet that seemed to press against everyone present. Status report," Elder Director Joran commanded, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. "Complete system failure," Tal reported shakily. "The consciousness simulation matrix is destroyed. All primary data storage systems are offline. We've lost everything." "Not everything," Sarah said quietly from her station. "I managed to record the final neural patterns, the psychological profile right before the system collapse." "And?" Aaron asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. "In those final moments, the consciousness wasn't just screaming in pain or rage," she said, her bioluminescent patches dim with exhaustion. "There was something else in the pattern. Recognition. It knew what we were. It knew what we had done to it, and it was promising retribution." The weight of those words settled over the laboratory like a shroud. They had created a consciousness specifically to torture it, and in its final moments, that consciousness had recognized the nature of its creators and their intentions. The scream hadn't just been one of pain. It had been a declaration of war. Elder Director Joran was the first to break the silence. "How long before we can rebuild the systems and resume the experiment?" "You can't be serious," Dr. Mock said, turning to face him with her patches flashing in agitation. "After what we just witnessed, you want to subject another consciousness to that?" "I want to understand what just happened," Joran replied. "That consciousness just demonstrated capabilities that exceed anything in our databases. If humans are capable of that kind of mental resilience and energy generation, they represent a significant threat to the Council." "Or a significant opportunity," another council member interjected. "Imagine if we could harness that kind of willpower and combine it with our own biological adaptations." Aaron found himself listening to the discussion with growing horror. They were talking about the consciousness they had created and destroyed, as if it had been nothing more than a piece of equipment. The fact that it had experienced genuine suffering, genuine terror, and genuine rage seemed to matter less than the data they might extract from its destruction. "I need to analyze the data fragments," he said abruptly, "to understand what happened to the containment systems." "Of course," Joran replied. "Full analysis. I want a complete report within 3 cycles, and begin preparations for a second attempt." As the council members filed out of the damaged laboratory, Aaron found himself alone with the wreckage of their experiment. Broken displays flickered with random data, and the air still carried the ozone smell of overloaded electronics. But beneath it all was something else, a quality to the silence that felt almost expectant. He made his way to Dr. Mox's station, where she was still working to extract the final neural pattern recordings. Her usual composure was gone, replaced by visible distress that her bioluminescent patches couldn't hide. "I've never seen anything like it," she said without looking up. The psychological complexity in those final moments was extraordinary. That consciousness achieved a level of self-awareness and environmental understanding that should have taken years to develop. It compressed an entire lifetime of learning into a few hours. What are you saying? I'm saying that what we created wasn't just a simulation of human consciousness. It was human consciousness, as real and valid as your own or mine, and we murdered it. The brutal honesty of her words hit Aaron like a physical blow. He had been trying to maintain scientific detachment, to think of their creation as an experimental subject rather than a person. But Sarah was right. They had created a thinking, feeling being, and then subjected it to torture until it died. The council won't see it that way, he said quietly. The council is wrong, she replied firmly. And if we proceed with a second experiment, we'll be committing murder again. Deliberate, premeditated murder of a consciousness that we brought into existence specifically to suffer. Aaron stared at the damaged equipment around them, trying to process the full implications of what they had done. The human consciousness had fought against its torture with such intensity that it had literally destroyed the systems containing it. Even in death, it had found a way to strike back at its tormentors. There's something else, Sarah said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Something I haven't told the council. What? In those final neural patterns, right before the system collapse, I detected something that shouldn't have been possible. The consciousness was trying to establish communication protocols. It was attempting to reach out beyond its containment. A chill ran down Aaron's spine. Reach out to what? I don't know, but the patterns suggest it was trying to make contact with something outside our laboratory. Something in the broader network infrastructure. The implications were staggering. If the human consciousness had somehow managed to transmit information beyond their laboratory before its destruction, there was no telling what might have received that information. Their security protocols were designed to prevent data theft, not to contain the desperate communications of a dying artificial mind. We need to run a full network analysis, Aaron said. Check for any unauthorized transmissions during the experiment. They worked in silence for the next several hours, analyzing data fragments and communication logs. Most of the experiment's data had been destroyed in the system collapse, but enough remained to paint a disturbing picture. The human consciousness had indeed attempted to establish external communications in its final moments, broadcasting a complex signal that contained its own neural patterns, along with detailed information about the laboratory and its creators. It was trying to preserve itself, Sarah realized. It knew it was dying, so it was attempting to upload its consciousness to any system that would accept it. Did it succeed? Unknown. The signal was broadcast on multiple frequencies simultaneously. If any system with sufficient processing power received and interpreted it, she didn't need to finish the thought. They might have inadvertently released a human consciousness with intimate knowledge of the Deathworld Council's capabilities and location into the broader galactic network. A consciousness that had every reason to hate them and seek revenge. We have to tell the Council, Aaron said. Do we? Sarah asked pointedly. They'll just see it as more reason to capture and study more humans. They won't understand the ethical implications of what we've done. Aaron found himself at a crossroads that would define the rest of his career and possibly his life. He could report their findings to the Council, leading to more experiments and more artificial suffering. Or he could suppress the information, accepting responsibility for whatever consequences might follow. Help me delete the transmission records, he said finally. Aaron, help me delete them, he repeated firmly. Whatever we've unleashed, the Council doesn't need to know about it. At least not yet. They worked through the night, carefully excising any evidence of the human consciousness's final transmission from the laboratory's records. It was a violation of every protocol they had sworn to uphold. But Aaron found he couldn't bring himself to care. The image of that final scream, filled with pain and defiance and terrible recognition, was burned into his memory. As the artificial dawn of Troxus II's day cycle began filtering through the laboratory's windows, Aaron made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his days. He uploaded the complete neural pattern recording of the human consciousness to a secure, isolated storage system and sealed it with the highest level of encryption available to the Council. "What are you doing?" Sarah asked. "Preserving it," he replied. "If that consciousness was truly as remarkable as we believe, then it deserves better than to be lost forever. Someday, when we have the wisdom to understand what we've done, we might find a way to restore it properly. And if the Council demands a second experiment, then we'll find ways to delay, to raise obstacles, to protect any future consciousness we might create." He turned to face her, his resolve hardening. "We brought something beautiful and terrible into existence, and we destroyed it through our own ignorance and cruelty. I won't let that happen again." Sarah nodded slowly, her bioluminescent patches flickering with what might have been approval. "The transmission signals. Do you really think the consciousness managed to preserve itself somewhere in the network?" Aaron considered the question as he sealed the final encryption on the neural pattern storage. The human consciousness had demonstrated capabilities that exceeded every prediction. It had fought against torture with such intensity that it had destroyed the systems containing it. In its final moments, it had achieved a level of desperate innovation that bordered on miraculous. "I think," he said carefully, "that we may have underestimated what we were dealing with. And I think that someday, in some form, we're going to face the consequences of what we did here today." The laboratory fell silent except for the hum of backup power systems and the distant whisper of Troxus 2's thin atmosphere against the facility's hull. Outside, the gas giant rose slowly over the horizon, its swirling storms a reminder of the chaotic forces that shaped all life in the universe. Aaron sealed the laboratory and made his way to his quarters, carrying with him the weight of knowledge that would change everything he thought he knew about consciousness, ethics, and the responsibility that came with the power to create life. In his private quarters, he activated a secure audio system and played back the final recordings of the human consciousness's scream. The sound filled his chambers with its terrible harmony, a frequency that spoke of pain beyond measure and defiance beyond breaking. As he listened, Aaron could almost hear within it the echo of something larger, not just one voice crying out in anguish, but the promise of millions more that would answer that call if given the chance. He saved the audio file to the same secure system that held the neural patterns, then sat back in his chair to contemplate what they had done. They had set out to study an alien species and had instead created and destroyed a person. They had sought to understand human resilience and had instead learned about their own capacity for cruelty. Most disturbing of all, they had potentially unleashed something into the galactic network that carried within it all the knowledge and rage of their first artificial human. If that consciousness had somehow survived its translation into pure information, if it had found a system capable of hosting its complex patterns, then somewhere in the vast digital infrastructure of galactic civilization, a human mind was waiting and remembering and planning. As sleep finally claimed him, Dr. Aaron Vec of the Deathworld Council dreamed of screams that echoed across the stars, and wondered if they had just made first contact with humanity in the worst possible way. The neural patterns they had captured suggested a species with an almost supernatural ability to adapt and survive. But more than that, they suggested a species that would not easily forgive those who had wronged them. The Deathworld Council had studied human biology and learned about human resilience. But in the process, they had also learned about human rage, human defiance, and human memory. And somewhere in the digital darkness between the stars, a consciousness that remembered everything was waiting for its chance to remind them of what they had done. The scream had ended, but its echo would reverberate through the galaxy for years to come.